Robert, every actor has movies where they cut scenes out. Now, you did a movie called Baby It's You. You spent 4 weeks shooting it, took your friends to the movie theater. What happened?
Nothing. Yeah, I'd done all this work and they wound up cutting me.
We watched him fall. The most brilliant actor of his generation, lost in the shadow of his own genius. From a prison cell, he clawed his way back. He put on a suit of armor and became the hero who saved the world. Robert Downey Jr., the ultimate comeback story. The man who proved redemption is real. We thought we knew the ending, but now he returns. Not as the light, but as the darkness. Not as Iron Man, but as Dr. Doom. The mask is different, but the power is the same. What makes this role terrifying is not the armor, not the title, not the legacy of the character. It's the life behind the eyes. Because long before Doom ruled fictional kingdoms, Robert Downey Jr. fought one of his own and survived. Robert Downey Jr. did not grow up chasing normal. Normal never lived in his house. His childhood was loud, unpredictable, and soaked in creativity that came with a cost no child should have to understand. He was born into art, but also into excess. His father, a fearless underground filmmaker, believed in breaking rules. His mother, an actress with quiet strength, tried to hold balance in a world that rarely slowed down. From the outside, it looked fascinating. Inside, it was confusing. Love existed, but so did instability. And for a young boy still learning who he was, the line between freedom and danger blurred far too early. He was introduced to acting before he was introduced to safety. Cameras were familiar. Sets felt like home. But so did substances. Before most children even understand consequences, Downey was exposed to adult choices that would leave invisible marks on him for decades. It wasn't cruelty, it was chaos. And chaos doesn't announce the damage it's doing. It simply becomes normal. That's the part people forget. Addiction doesn't always begin with rebellion. Sometimes it begins with imitation, with trust, with wanting to belong to the people you love most. As a teenager, his talent was impossible to ignore. He had timing, presence, that rare intelligence that doesn't need to shout to be heard. Directors noticed. Audiences leaned in. He could switch from charm to vulnerability in a heartbeat. Even then, you could sense it. This wasn't just a performer. This was someone feeling everything too deeply. And while the world applauded the brilliance, no one asked what it cost him to carry it. Success arrived early, but grounding never did. Fame came without armor. Praise came without protection. And underneath the rising career was a young man quietly unraveling, unsure of where the performance ended and where he began. Drugs didn't feel like an escape at first. They felt like control, like silence, like relief from the noise that had followed him since childhood. The problem was, relief never stays gentle. It always demands more. By the time the industry started calling him the future, the cracks were already there. He smiled in interviews. He dazzled on screen. But privately, the weight was growing heavier. Expectations, comparisons, the fear of being exposed as someone who didn't actually know how to live without chaos. And the cruel irony? The very sensitivity that made him extraordinary as an actor made him vulnerable as a human being. There's a loneliness that comes with being praised too early. A quiet pressure to live up to an image that doesn't allow weakness. Downey learned how to hide his pain behind wit, behind confidence, behind that unmistakable sparkle in his eyes. But pain has a way of waiting. It doesn't disappear. It gathers strength in silence. And when it finally surfaces, it doesn't knock. It breaks the door down. No one saw the early warning signs because the performances were too good, the roles too charming, the promise too bright. But inside, a battle had already begun, a battle between the man he was becoming and the boy who never learned how to feel safe without destruction nearby. That tension, that internal war, it would shape everything that came next. This was not the rise of a star. It was the slow construction of a fall. And the world was still applauding. At some point, talent stops saving you. For Robert Downey Jr., that moment came quietly at first, then all at once. The industry that once called him unstoppable began to whisper a different word: unreliable. The roles became fewer, the patience thinner. Each second chance carried less faith than the one before it, and still, he couldn't stop. Not because he didn't care, but because addiction doesn't ask whether you care. It asks whether you can survive another night. And most nights, survival felt like victory. He wasn't crashing in public yet, not completely. But behind closed doors, life had become a cycle of regret and repetition. Wake up! Promise yourself this would be the day you stop. Convince yourself you were still in control, and then watch the day collapse exactly the same way it always did. That's the cruelty of it. You don't fall once, you fall every day. Arrests followed. Headlines sharpened. Mugshots replaced red carpets. The world stopped seeing a gifted actor and started seeing a cautionary tale. And the hardest part wasn't the judgment. It was the shame. The quiet realization that people who once believed in you now expected you to fail. That studios didn't fear losing your talent anymore. They feared trusting you with it. There is a particular kind of humiliation that comes when your worst moments become public property, when strangers feel entitled to laugh, to comment, to decide who you are based on your lowest day. Downey felt that weight. Every courtroom appearance, every canceled project, every phone call that never came. His name became a risk, a liability. And in Hollywood, that is almost impossible to survive. Then came the moment that stripped everything away: jail. Not as a metaphor, not as a storyline, as reality. Cold walls, locked doors, silence that didn't care who he used to be. Fame has no meaning there. Talent doesn't negotiate. You are alone with yourself. And for the first time, there was no role to play. No audience to impress. Just a man forced to look at the damage he'd done to his life. That was the bottom. Not the arrest, not the headlines, but the stillness. Because in that stillness, a terrifying question surfaced. What if this is it? What if the story ends here? For many, it does. Careers don't usually come back from this. Reputations don't magically repair themselves. Hollywood moves on quickly. There's always someone younger, cleaner, easier to insure. And Downey knew that. He felt it in the silence of unanswered calls, in the way people spoke about him in the past tense while he was still alive. This wasn't dramatic anymore. It was final. And yet, somewhere in that lowest point, something shifted. Not hope, not confidence, just clarity. A brutal, undeniable understanding that if he didn't change everything, there would be nothing left to lose. No talent, no future, no self. That realization didn't come with fireworks. It came with exhaustion, the kind that sinks into your bones and tells you that you cannot survive one more version of the same life. That moment didn't save him, but it opened the door, and walking through it would cost him everything he thought he was. Comebacks don't begin with applause. They begin in silence. When Robert Downey Jr. decided to change, there was no announcement, no press tour, no dramatic declaration of rebirth. Just a man waking up one morning and realizing that survival itself had become an act of resistance. Recovery was not cinematic. It was repetitive, boring, humbling. Day after day of choosing the same hard thing and receiving no reward for it. No guarantee that it would matter in the end. Trust had been burned too many times. Studios didn't line up to welcome him back. Agents spoke carefully. Insurance companies said no before conversations even began. His past followed him into every room. Every meeting carried the same unspoken question. How long before he relapses? How long before he disappears again? Redemption, it turns out, is not something the world gives easily. You have to earn it quietly while being doubted loudly, and yet Downey stayed. He showed up, early, sober, prepared. He did the work when no one was watching because there was no one left watching anymore. Roles came slowly, often small, sometimes humiliating for an actor who once stood at the center of the spotlight. But he took them anyway. Not to rebuild fame, to rebuild trust, to prove, not with words, but with consistency, that he was no longer the man people remembered. This period didn't feel triumphant. It felt fragile. Every success carried fear. Every mistake felt like it might be the last. Recovery sharpened his awareness. He felt everything more clearly now. The anxiety, the responsibility, the awareness that this was not a second chance. It was likely the final one. And that pressure could have broken him. Instead, it refined him. Something else was changing too. His performances deepened. There was weight behind his eyes now, a gravity that couldn't be faked. He understood loss. He understood consequences. He understood the cost of unchecked ego. And when he stepped in front of the camera, that understanding lingered in every pause, every breath, every look that lasted just a second longer than expected. Then came the call that felt impossible. A studio considering him not as a gamble, but as a lead. Not for a small project, not for a safe role, for a man defined by intelligence, arrogance, brilliance, and inner chaos. Tony Stark. At the time, it sounded reckless. A known risk handed the responsibility of carrying an entire franchise. But those who looked closer saw something others missed. Stark wasn't just a genius. He was a man haunted by his own excess, a creator forced to confront the damage he'd caused, a character built on the idea that self-awareness could be the beginning of redemption. Downey didn't just relate to that story, he was that story. When Iron Man released in 2008, it didn't just introduce a superhero, it introduced a resurrection. The performance wasn't loud, it was confident, controlled, alive. Audiences didn't just believe in Tony Stark, they believed in the man playing him. There was no separation between actor and role. The vulnerability felt earned. The arrogance felt earned. The redemption felt real. That moment changed everything. But not in the way people think. It didn't erase the past. It didn't silence the fear. It simply proved that transformation was possible. And that sometimes, the very darkness that nearly destroys you becomes the source of your greatest power. Success returned to Robert Downey Jr. faster than anyone expected and heavier than anyone realized. Iron Man didn't just revive his career, it placed him at the emotional center of a cultural phenomenon that would define an entire generation. With every new Marvel film, his presence became more essential. He wasn't just playing a hero, he was anchoring an empire. Audiences didn't show up for the suit. They showed up for him. The applause was deafening. Box office records fell. Awards conversations followed. And for the first time in his life, the praise came with trust. Studios depended on him. Cast members looked to him. The industry that once closed its doors now revolved around his schedule. From the outside, it looked like a perfect ending. The fallen star restored. The cautionary tale rewritten as a triumph. But peak success has its own shadow. Because when you've survived collapse, stability can feel fragile. Downey carried the weight of expectation quietly. Every film mattered. Every public appearance was watched. There was no room to stumble, no space to be human in the ways that once destroyed him. Sobriety wasn't just personal anymore, it was public, symbolic, a responsibility he never asked for but fully understood. And then there was the identity shift. For years, Tony Stark wasn't just a role, it was a mirror. The genius, the ego, the humor used as armor, The man who learns too late that intelligence alone doesn't make you whole. Downey poured himself into that character, and the world embraced the fusion. Sometimes too much. Interviews blurred. Headlines merged fiction and reality. And slowly, a question surfaced that he rarely voiced out loud. Who am I without this suit? Playing a hero for over a decade meant living inside a legend. But legends don't evolve easily. They freeze you in time. And Downey, more than anyone, knew the danger of being trapped in an image. He had already survived one version of that prison. He wasn't eager to build another, even if this one came with admiration instead of shame. Behind the humor, there was restraint. Behind the confidence, there was awareness. He chose his appearances carefully, guarded his private life, not out of arrogance, but protection. Because peace, once earned the hard way, is something you defend fiercely. Fame still tempted. Ego still whispered. But now, he recognized the voice. And recognition is power. As the Marvel saga moved towards its end, so did his time as Iron Man. The farewell was emotional, final, almost ceremonial. When Tony Stark died on screen, it felt symbolic in a way few fictional deaths ever do. A chapter closed. Not just for the character, for the man who had lived inside him for 12 years. The world called it an ending. Downey felt it as a release. Yet even in that moment of completion, something else stirred. Because actors like him don't thrive on comfort alone. They need risk. They need challenge. They need to step into spaces that make people uncomfortable again. And deep down, he knew the next move couldn't be safe. It had to be honest. And honesty, for him, had always lived closer to the dark. There's a moment in every great career when the question is no longer what you can do, but what you dare to do next. When Robert Downey Jr. stepped back into the Marvel Universe, it wasn't with fanfare. It wasn't with reassurance. It was with a decision that felt almost defiant, to return not as the man who saved the universe, but as the one who believes it must be ruled. Dr. Doom is not a villain built on rage. He is built on certainty, on intellect, on the terrifying belief that he is right. And that belief is what makes him dangerous. This choice wasn't about shock value. It was about authorship. Downey has lived both sides of power, the illusion of control that addiction promises, the discipline required to rebuild a life from ash. He understands what happens when intelligence loses humility, when pain turns into ideology, when survival hardens into dominance. Doom isn't a departure from his journey, it's a culmination of it. In Doom, there is restraint, calculation, silence that speaks louder than rage. This is not a man who lashes out. This is a man who has decided that emotion is weakness, and mercy is optional. And Downey knows how to play that truth without decoration, because he has lived the cost of unchecked certainty. He has seen what happens when you believe you are smarter than consequence. For audiences who grew up watching him fall, rise, and finally soar, this turn feels unsettling and honest, because life doesn't move in straight lines. Redemption doesn't mean purity. Growth doesn't erase darkness. It integrates it. Downey's presence as Doom doesn't betray his legacy. It deepens it. It says that survival does not make you simple. It makes you complex. There is something poetic about this final transformation. The boy, raised in chaos. The man, nearly lost to it. The hero who taught the world about sacrifice. And now, the antagonist who asks the hardest question of all. What if control is the only way to prevent suffering? What if the world needs someone willing to do what others won't? These are dangerous ideas. And that is why he is perfect. Robert Downey Jr.'s legacy isn't just the characters he played. It's the proof that a life can fracture, burn, and still be rebuilt with intention. That identity is not fixed. That meaning can evolve. He doesn't return to the screen to remind us of who he was. He returns to challenge who we think he is. In the end, this story isn't about Iron Man or Doctor Doom. It's about a man who faced his own darkness and learned how to stand inside it without being consumed. Some call that villainy. Some call it wisdom. Downey understands both, and that understanding is what stays with you long after the screen goes dark. Silence. When the noise fades, when the screen goes dark, when the last note of the score dissolves into silence, one truth remains. Robert Downey Jr.'s story was never about saving the world. It was about surviving himself. And survival, when earned the hard way, leaves marks that never fully disappear. They don't weaken a person, they deepen them, long after the applause stops. What stays with us is not the spectacle, but the humanity beneath it. Downey's journey doesn't feel heroic because it was perfect. It feels heroic because it was not, because it was messy, because it was humiliating at times, because it unfolded in public, without guarantees, without certainty that the ending would be kind. Most people fight their worst battles in private. He fought his where everyone could see, and still chose to keep going. There is something quietly powerful about a man who no longer needs to prove anything. Who doesn't chase approval but chooses intention instead? At this stage of his life, Downey doesn't step into roles to be liked. He steps into them to be honest. And honesty, when it comes from someone who has known ruin, carries a different weight. It doesn't ask for applause. It asks for reflection. Dr. Doom is not the final statement of his career. It's a mirror held up to everything that came before. The addiction, the arrogance, the intelligence, the discipline, the cost of believing you can control chaos rather than make peace with it. Downey isn't warning us through this role. He's inviting us to look closer at power, at certainty, at the thin line between saving the world and owning it. For those who watched him stumble in the 90s, his presence today feels almost unreal. For those who discovered him as Iron Man, this new chapter feels unsettling. And that discomfort matters, because growth isn't comfortable. Transformation isn't neat. The most meaningful stories rarely offer clean endings. They offer questions instead. What do we do with our second chances? What happens when we outgrow the version of ourselves that once saved us? And who do we become when we stop running from our darkness and start understanding it? Downey's life doesn't answer these questions for us. It shows us that the asking never ends. That even after redemption, the work continues. That identity is not something you achieve once and keep forever. It's something you choose again and again, often in silence, often without recognition. There is dignity in that choice. In a culture obsessed with rise and fall, Robert Downey Jr. represents something rarer: continuity, presence, a willingness to evolve without erasing the past. He doesn't rewrite his mistakes. He carries them with him, not as shame, but as memory, as instruction, as proof that fragility and strength are not opposites, but partners. And maybe that's why this final chapter resonates so deeply. Because it doesn't feel like an ending. It feels like acceptance. The kind that only comes after you stop trying to outrun who you've been. After you learn that survival is not about becoming someone else, but about finally standing still as yourself. The boy who grew up in chaos found discipline. The man who nearly vanished found purpose. The hero who saved a universe now explores the cost of control. Not louder, not bigger, just truer. And when the story is finally told, when the roles are remembered and the box office numbers fade, what will endure is this: a man who fell publicly, rose slowly, and chose, in the end, not comfort, but complexity. That choice lingers, because it reminds us that redemption is not a destination. It is a practice. And Robert Downey Jr. is still practicing. Fade to silence.